cracks or imperfections. It's good to work with nice fresh clay when you're making a ring. I'm going to straighten this around the mandrel because coiled shapes and strips that are curled tend to crack when you have clay that's a little dried out. So I'll just let that dry, and I'm going to set that aside and just let that dry for a while on the ring mandrel. After the ring is dried and you've removed the paper strip from it, you can sand it using a nail file or a flat piece of sandpaper and work the ring around in a circular fashion on the sandpaper. And that will help remove any rough edges and smooth it out. And make sure it's nice and level on both sides of the ring shank. As another step, you can go around with your nail file and bevel it slightly around the edge so your ring has a softer feel when it's on your finger. You don't want a nice corner that's uncomfortable. And so I'm just sanding that at a slight angle. And then to get the inside of the ring, use a little piece of sanding paper or sanding cloth and carefully go around at an angle. And I'm sanding the inside edge at an angle, so this ring will have a nice contour to the inside. And be very careful at this stage. The ring is extremely fragile. I'm not pressing on the sides of it, I'm just gently holding it and gently working this around because this is very fragile and could just break in two when I'm working and sanding it, so go easy. You also have the opportunity after it's fired to refine and sand the metal after it's been fired as well, but the more you do at this stage, the easier it is. And as a final pass, I'll take a little water with just my finger and run it around the edges. At this point, now we're ready to go ahead and add the flower to the ring. And I flipped my ring mandrel over so that it's a little bit smaller size to let this dry on. And I'm sliding my ring over a piece of paper again because you don't want it to be in direct contact with the aluminum because it reacts with metal clay. And I'll use my syringe clay to put a little dot of syringe on the top of the ring shank. And I have my flower that's been drying, and I will stick it right on top of there and press it well. I'll just let that sit and dry until it's thoroughly dry on there. After your ring is dry, you can go ahead and refine any edges, any little problems you see, and go ahead and add a little bit of extra syringe clay or paste around any little joints or edges. I like to turn it over and try to use a little soft clay or syringe clay and add more to make sure that that ring shank is very securely fastened on there as that dries. And then you can refine your petals too in the same way. Go around the whole flower, again being gentle, but don't be afraid to go ahead and use the water, and it will take care of these little raggedy edges that any left from the cookie cutter that you have. And I'm going to add a little more to the edges to make sure this is very secure. You just add a little syringe clay. Use your paintbrush. I've got this really wet here. Oops, trying to get rid of some of the water here. That's really wet. You don't need it quite so wet there. And go ahead and make sure you have a very secure connection and do the other side and keep adding a little syringe clay until that ring shank is secure with the top of the ring. It really helps to support it while it's drying, and you can either use a little dish with sand in it, or in this case I have sugar, and that'll help support the ring so that nothing tips over and it just sits there nicely like that, and you can let it dry until you're ready to fire it in the kiln. And then to fire the piece, this is a size 5 Hattie's Patty ring form, and this will help to make sure that when this ring fires, it will only shrink to the size, even though I've accounted for the difference in the shrinkage as far as the size go, it will ensure that it only shrinks to this size, and it makes it really nice because then you know your ring's going to fit well. So I'll turn this ring over when I'm ready to fire it and insert the ring form. And then on your kiln shelf, use a little bit of fiber blanket on each side to support it, to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere or roll off when you're firing it, and fire it just like that in the kiln. This could be fired at 1650 degrees Fahrenheit for any of the recommended times, anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 hours for maximum strength. After your ring has come out of the kiln, it will look white like this as it's just been fired. And you want to make sure you don't burnish it at this stage because we're going to add the gold accent with Aura 22. And you want to make sure it's very clean, so don't have oils of your fingers and be touching the center of the piece. So it's fresh out of the kiln. And Aura 22 comes in a little container like this, and then this is a little bit of the media that goes with it so that you can water it down if you need to as it dries. And what you'll want to do is just make sure you stir it up with a needle tool. And I use a needle tool instead of a toothpick so I don't lose most of my gold in the wood because it's very expensive to lose your gold. And it should be the consistency of cream, thin cream. So there we've got that mixed up. And use a small brush that you're going to devote just to your gold, and that way you can again use the gold that's in your brush and not have to lose any of it. And I'm using a very tiny paintbrush. I'm dipping it in the gold. And I'm applying a layer of gold to the center. Now the trick to this is getting a very even layer. A very consistent, even layer on the silver. Continue to coat the whole surface there with an even layer, and then let this dry thoroughly, maybe 20 minutes to half an hour, just until it turns to a lighter color and you can tell that it's dry. And then you'll add 2 more layers in the same way. And 3 layers will give you a very rich gold color that's consistent. So there I've got that, and I'm just going to sit that and let it dry. Now after I've applied 2 other layers for 3 total, then you will put this back in your kiln, or you can torch fire it, and you want to fire it at 850 degrees for no less than 15 minutes. And that will bring out the gold. And I've got a finished one here. To bring up the gold and silver after this has been fired, then you just use your brass brush and go ahead and brush the entire ring, and it'll burnish the gold and the silver at the same time and give you a beautiful finish like that. And there you have your completed daisy ring that's all shiny and ready to wear. For this project, I'm going to make a bezel frame out of metal clay that is a charm you can hang from a necklace or a charm bracelet, and you can insert and use your own photos and make them very personalized for anyone that you might want to give one to. The easiest way to do this is to make the frame first, and I'm starting with a lump of PMC Plus clay, and I'm using 4 cards on each side to make it 4 cards thick. And I'll just roll that out with my roller. And what I'm going to make is the frame part of my bezel first, which is the cutout of the inside shape. And I'm using a small clay cutter like this, and it's a square shape, and I'm cutting the inside shape of my frame. So let's just cut that and use a knife or a needle tool just to remove the center like this. And then just simply set that aside to dry for a minute while you make the background. And then use another ball of clay flattened, and this time I'm going to take away a card on each side, and this is 3 cards thick. Roll that out nice and even, and then add a little bit of water to attach the 2. So this is the background piece. I'm adding water to make an attachment, and then lay the center of the frame that you just cut out right on top of this backing sheet and press it well with your fingers. And then you'll see why this is such a quick way to make a frame. Now, you could cut this into any shape you want. I'm just going to make a square frame for this little bird necklace that I'm making. And I'm going to use just a straight blade like this and cut the frame out, cut 4 sides. And you're cutting through both layers so you have a nice even edge and you can't see the layers when you're done. After you've cut the sides, you have your frame here, and I'm going to add little hooks These little hooks are especially made for metal clay, and they are 950 silver, which means they aren't quite sterling, and they fire really well with pure silver clay in the kiln. And you simply take tweezers to insert them on the top and the bottom, and I'll put the top in here. And bury it as deeply as you can. Remember that your clay is going to shrink a little, so you want to bury the hook very deeply so that you don't see the end of it. And it's okay if a little of it pops out in the center. We're going to be covering that with the image. Take the other hook on the bottom, and this is optional. If you want to add a little bead dangle, you can add this piece, or you can just leave it as is. And try to center it, and again, bury this deeply into the clay. And you can see why it's good to work when the clay is still soft so that you can get it in there. And use your rubber-shaped tool if you need to fix any of the edges or refine anything that you've pushed aside with the hook. And then I'm going just to let that dry for a while, and then I'll refine the edges after it's dried for a bit. And I have one here that's been drying for a while, and you can tell that it's easily picked up and ready to refine. And to refine this, I'm going to use just a simple nail file around the edge to get rid of any rough edges, and just go around each edge, filing off the rough surface, any imperfections that you see. And I like to round the edges just a bit on each corner to soften it. And it also feels nicer when it becomes a pendant or something if you don't have sharp, pointy edges on your frame. Be gentle as you file at this stage because your frame is very fragile until it's fired. You can get right next to the hook, being careful to file carefully around all the edges. I'm worrying about the outside of my frame, but not the inside, because the inside, if it's kind of rough, that actually just gets covered up by my image and actually helps to just hold the glue and the resin in place if it's just a little bit rougher on the inside of the frame. So I'm not even worried about finishing that very well. And you can file it on a finer grit of your sanding board if you'd like. And then after you've sanded all of the edges, use water as a final step. I just use a little paintbrush and go around the edges and make sure that it's just nice and smooth. And the water helps to remove any little rough edges that you might have. And then you can smooth the top of the frame too. Make sure that it's as nice as you'd like it. Another option is you could texture this frame before you cut it out and have a nice textured pattern around here if you'd like. There, and that's ready to be fired. So you can go ahead and put that on your kiln shelf. I've got one that's fired here, and you can see that it needs burnished. And these hooks come out a little black from the kiln, but that's okay, that will burnish away. And I start with my brass brush, and I'm simply just brushing the silver to burnish it. The brush will give you a soft matte finish to the metal, but if you want a higher shine, I'll show you how to bring it up to a higher polish with polishing papers. After I've brass brushed my piece, I can bring this surface up to a very high shine by using various grits of sanding papers. And I'm going to start with the coarsest one, and I number these 1 through 5 so that I can remember which one I'm supposed to use next. And the first one, you go ahead and sand off, and this is sanding the metal down slightly, and it's also burnishing it at the same time. And the reason you want to start with coarse to fine progressively is if you skip steps, then you miss some of the deeper scratches that you might have in the metal that you just can't get to. Go around the front and then do your edges. You can also use a polishing wheel and mechanical polishing disc if you would like, and that would speed it up, especially for production work if you're going to be making a lot of these. And then we'll move to number 2, which is a little bit less coarse than the first one. And with each progressive paper, you will see that it becomes shinier and shinier, the metal does. And of course, if you have a texture, this won't be as, you'll be sanding your texture down a little bit, so you'll probably just want to stop with the brass brush and then possibly put it in a rock tumbler with some stainless steel mixed shot and tumble it, and you'll get a very burnished effect with a very textured piece if you need to. And finally the last one. And there are grits that go beyond this, but for this project I'm going about 5 steps of sanding this with sanding papers. And you'll see that you get a really reflective silver from using all those polishing papers. And this one's ready to go. A common question that people often have is, how do I put photos in my bezel and what kind of paper can I use? And so I'm going to try to clear that up with a few examples here. This first example is made with the inkjet printer. And I've put some resin over the surface of the color, and you can see that it has an area where the white of the paper has become clear or discolored from the resin, but the ink tends to stay fairly true, but you still don't want to lose the white of your paper here. This next example was made on a color copier, which is a toner-based laser printer, and again the same thing happened where you have the resin soaking into the paper, and you'll see on the back side that it soaks through and the paper becomes clear and you lose the white of your paper. And it does muddy the inks just a bit. So to remedy this, you need to coat your paper either way with decoupage medium or Mod Podge. And this is Mod Podge, and this is a product that I like to use that works really well to seal your images before you apply resin to them. With these two examples then, I have this picture, and this was done on an inkjet printer, and I've sealed it with Mod Podge, and you'll notice that Mod Podge, because it's water-based, has dissolved some of the ink, and then I have the resin over it. And so this is not as preferable as this example, which is a color photocopy made on a laser printer. It's been coated with a layer of Mod Podge, and you retain the white of your paper. You'll see around the edge here that we've got a nice white paper, and then once you place the resin layer over it, you retain a clean, crisp image. And so this is the method I prefer, is go to your copy center and have a color copy made of your photos or your images, and be sure to seal the edges really well, because if you don't seal the edges of your paper, then your resin will leach in and you'll get a little bit of discoloration that way. And try not to use your original photos, because you want to make sure that the plastics don't interfere with your resin. After you've polished your frame here, I've got one that I want to fit into the frame. And so I've cut out this photocopy of this little bird image. A trick to get this to fit is you center it up in there and then press with your fingers around the edge. And this way you can see where you need to cut out your image. And then I just use scissors to cut it out to fit the frame along the little lines that you made when you pressed it in there. And then go ahead and check the fit. Drop your image in the frame and make sure that it fits still a little big there. And it's perfect, it's going to fit in there. Okay, use some of your decoupage glue to seal the edges first. And this is the way I always work, is I go around the edge of my image and I apply the glue. And this is really an important step, because even though it's a photocopy and the ink will stay fast, the resin will find its way into these edges and create a little discoloration and that sort of clear paper effect that you don't want. So go all around the edges and apply the glue, and then apply glue on both the front and the back of the image, and let it dry between each side. And then you can plop it into your little frame when you've got both sides glued. And I'll just let that dry right there. And I have a sample that's been dried already and ready to fill with resin. Now at this stage, make sure that your glue is perfectly dry before you fill it with resin, because you don't want any wet glue interfering. Resin does not like to have moisture in the way. And you also want to make sure you don't get any fogging of your image because your glue didn't dry clear. This is Envirotex Light epoxy resin, and it's a common one that you can find in most craft stores. It mixes 1-to-1, so it's very easy to mix and to use, and it creates a beautiful glass-like coating on your piece in your frame. With all resins, you want to wear gloves so that you don't get it on your skin. And then you also want to wear a respirator, and you want to have proper ventilation in the room that you're using the resin in. So you also want to protect your eyes. So this is something that you really want to take great care when you're working with it. You use a little cup and a stir stick. And I'm going to pour equal amounts in this cup, and you want to be really careful when you measure it. This cup has graduated lines on it that tell you how much you've got in the cup. So I'm just mixing a little bit. I've got 1 gram there. And then I'll add 1 more here of this, the resiner and then the hardener. Then you use your stir stick and you mix this really well. And you want to keep stirring for quite a long time to make sure it's thoroughly mixed. It's a good idea with resin to then mix it into a second cup and mix 1 more time thoroughly. And then you are extra careful about making sure that it gets mixed thoroughly. If there's just the slightest bit caught in the corner of the cup or on the side of the cup that's not thoroughly mixed in, then you have problems with your resin not curing. So I'm going to just keep working on this. And you scrape the sides of the cup, and you want to do a stirring motion instead of a whipping motion because you don't want too many air bubbles. I've got a few in there now that I can get those out in a minute. And you have about close to an hour's working time with this resin, so you don't have to worry about being in a rush that it'll set up too quickly. You really want your project to be successful. After your resin is thoroughly mixed, then you can apply it to your image inside your frame here. I'm just using a little craft stick. I'm just dropping a little bit of the resin into the frame, making sure that I don't overfill it. And this resin, as it cures, will self-level and kind of reach out towards the corners. Now, to release the bubbles, I like to use a heat gun that you can get at any rubber stamp store or craft store, and it's meant for embossing powders, and it works great to add enough heat to get those little bubbles out of the surface of the resin. Hold it directly over your image, straight overhead, so you're not blowing resin out to the side, and turn it on. And you will see that it makes all of those little bubbles rise to the surface and dissipate. And then you just let your piece dry. It needs to cure for at least 3 days like that, or overnight until you can lift it and move it around. And preferably in a really warm environment, that works the best for curing resin and also for keeping the bubbles out of it. If you notice that you accidentally get a little bit too much resin in there, just use the corner of a paper towel and it'll help wick out the excess resin. You can do this while it's still fairly wet. And just keep removing the excess that way, and make sure that it's nice and level in your frame so that you don't have resin all over the edges. There, and that looks like it's going to be just fine there and stay inside the frame. After you've filled your little frame with resin, then you can go ahead and add a chain to make a necklace and a little bead dangle to add a little bit of interest to this, or you can make a series of these and add them to a charm bracelet and attach them in a row on a chain. Really, you can make any type of jewelry that you want with any image that you want. Not only do bezels work well for pictures that you might want to put in your bracelet or jewelry piece, but in this piece we're using polymer clay to fill each bezel instead of an image or resin or anything like that. And it adds a nice change for adding color to your metal. We're using an unusual shape for the bezel, and I'll start right here with a little bit of clay, and I've got 4 cards on each side because that's the thickness I want my bezel frame to be. And we'll start with the top part. I'm just using my roller to roll out a sheet of clay. And on these you can use any variety, any type of metal clay that you would like to on this. Just remember to account for shrinkage, that your bezel will shrink a little bit according to the type of clay that's used. And I have these 2 cookie cutters that you can find at a cake decorating supply or bakery supply store. And what I want to do is cut out my center first. So I'm using this shape. and cutting out the center, and I'll just use my needle tool to remove the center. And I'm going to set this piece aside for a minute while I make the background of my frame. Roll out your clay 2 cards thick. If you need to add a little oil to your board or your roller so that it won't stick, that's helpful too. I'm getting it sticky a little bit there. And then use a little bit of water. I usually put it on the background sheet, that's a little bit easier. And a little bit on my piece that I'm going to apply. And you simply laminate the 2 layers like this by placing one over the top of the other, and use your fingers to attach the 2, pressing it. And because the clay is still so wet in both layers, the water will be fine to attach the 2. And then to cut the outside of my bezel, I'm just using this cookie cutter and I'm looking straight down through it, lining it up, and cutting through all the layers at the same time. Pop that out of your cookie cutter and you have your first piece. And continue to just let that dry as you continue making as many links as you want for your bracelet or whatever jewelry piece you're working on. Before it gets too dry, I'm going to go ahead and put some holes in this. I like to use a needle tool to go ahead and make a few guide holes here. And on this one, I'm making a hole on each end so that I'll have room for my jump rings. And I'm going to move this around in a circular motion to enlarge the hole, and then after it dries, I'll go ahead and refine those holes, and especially on the back side. So that's ready to go. On this particular design, on every other piece, I've put the holes either on these 2 points or inside to alternate them on here and here. So you let those dry. When the piece is dry, it looks like this, and you can pick it up and it's feeling like it's sort of a chalky feeling, and you know that it's ready to go. Here for refining, you need to refine the edges before you fire it in a kiln or torch fire it. And I'm using just an ordinary nail file to smooth the edges off and get rid of any of the marks left by the cookie cutter. And you can round the edges, go around each edge, filing off any imperfections that you see. The cookie cutter tends to leave a little lip of clay that you need to remove. And then if you have areas that are a little harder to get to, you can use a file to get into these little narrow areas. And this is just a small needle file that you can find at a hardware store. And it works really well to get into these tight areas where I need to refine it. And now to get these holes worked up, you'll notice on the back sometimes your holes are a little smaller because you created them from the front side. And so I just use the tip of my X-Acto knife and I just spin it around gently. I'm not putting pressure, I'm just letting the tool do the work because I'm being very careful not to break my clay at this point. And you'll see how easily that shaves out a nice hole. And remember again that your hole should err on the larger side because as it shrinks, you want to make sure that your jump rings will fit after you've fired it. There we go. As a final step, I will use a paintbrush and some clear water just to refine the surface and smooth it out. Go around the edges like this. Don't worry about the inside of your frame. I want that to stay rough, if anything, because that will help hold on to my polymer clay. And you'll notice too that you might have a nice undercut where the top layer sits on the bottom one, and that's actually very helpful too, because as you push the polymer clay in after it's been fired, that helps hold on to it. After I've finished smoothing out everything, I am ready to fire that, and fire that at any temperature that's applicable for the clay that you are using. After you've finished firing your piece, then go ahead and brass brush it or tumble it, finish it with your polishing papers, and then you work it up to a shine. This one's worked up to a high shine. This has been placed in a rock tumbler with stainless steel shot and also polished with polishing papers, and you get a high shine, and we're ready to fill this with polymer clay. To make sure that the polymer clay sticks into your bezel really well, I use this product called Sobo white glue, and I coat the inside of the bezel with it. It just takes a little bit,